Hello, I'm Ilwoo Lyu. Today I'll present a spherical data augmentation to improve cortical surface annotation. So we use our recent surface registration technique to generate intermediate registration result, and we use this information to obtain more samples for better data training. So here's the motivation for our study. So brain regions are associated with cognitive functions or behavior. So all the regions are connected to some specific functions. And also, as we know, in sulci in our brain are also associated with these functions very deeply. So the brain annotation, meaning the labeling of cortical surface, are very critical step to understand these such functions in neuroscience studies. So the critical question in cortical surface annotation is to divide brain regions into meaningful subparts. So we can think about the subdivision of our brain in terms of defining a protocol, but we are not focusing on that kind of process in this project. Instead, given a protocol, our question is how we get the segmentation of our brain to several meaningful pieces, like in this figure for cortical parcellation, or how we assign a meaningful circle labels for each circle basins, like in this figure. So the goal of this approach is to assign a meaningful labels for each vertex. So we can say this is a semantic segmentation of cortical surfaces. Here are a couple of challenges in cortical surface annotation. First, the cortical surfaces has higher structural variability. So if you look at this figure, then they all have exactly the same number of labels. But if you focus on some region of this brain, for example, this yellow one, then we can see this yellow one exists here and here and here. But their actual boundary looks very different, which means they have all structural variability. And also, if we think about the actual brain data, the annotated data for training or for machine learning, whatever technique we like to use to understand the cortical surface variability, then the annotated data is really limited. So if we think about computer vision society, then it is very common to use less million or billion data for the training. But if we focus on our neuroimaging data, then it's usually a very limited number of samples, normally less than 1,000. So it's somehow hard to learn the high variability given limited number. And also, if we think about the acquisition of the data, then it's also very expensive. So if we look at the neuroimaging data, then we need an expert to get the images, and also we need some time to get those images. And it's kind of very expensive process, even get single images from one subject. And finally, since we are handling cortical surface data, which is 3D mesh, so it is way more complicated than this standard 2D or 3D image. So how we incorporate this high dimensional data into the machine learning technique is also critical challenges in this field. Here are key ideas of our approach. So first, we're going to use spherical convolutional neural nets for label prediction. So this is a kind of convolutional neural net in the computer vision field, but we adopted this idea for label prediction to handle the high variability in cortical surface data. But as we discussed in the previous slide, we have kind of limited samples for training, but it is quite known that if we have many samples for convolutional net, then we can expect a kind of desirable result. But in our case, we still have a limited data. So in this project, our focus is not spherical unit development or convolutional net itself, but we instead focus on the geometric data augmentation to improve the size of the training samples. So we'll use our recent spherical registration to get the data augmentation. Here's a brief motivation for our cortical surface data augmentation. So let's think about this example. So let's say we have this human faces to recognize those two people. So if we are training our model using this neutral facial expression, and we use this information to identify a different facial expression here, then it might be somehow difficult for machine learning techniques to understand these people because they have a totally different facial expression. But what if we have an intermediate facial changes like this? So once we know this information, and if we use this data for additional training samples, then it'll be very helpful for the machine learning techniques to understand those two people, because we know the intermediate changes, the facial changes here. So the idea of our approach is very similar to that. So let's say we have two samples in our training data. So what if we know the intermediate change between those two samples? So for example, we take those two samples here, then now we can compute the trajectory of deformation between those two samples. So we can slightly deform this sample, and also we can keep deforming these samples to be aligned with the target sample in this figure. So we have another deformation here, and we have a finer deformation which is very similar to target samples. So once we have this trajectory, then we can simply collect all the intermediate samples as our training set. So the question is how we get such a trajectory to get the synthetic samples. Okay, so to connect the idea to the data augmentation on spheres, so let's talk about spherical registration here. So the spherical registration is to find a correspondence between two surfaces. So we have cortical surfaces here, but usually we can assume that all these cortical surfaces have a spherical topology. So we can extract any features from the surfaces, like a mean curvature or whatever geometric features, and then we can map all these cortical features onto a unisphere. So we have a unisphere in this example, and we can map these features on this unisphere like this. And this is an initial configuration for the spherical registration. Once we have those two feature mapped, then our goal is to find a displacement to guide one feature to the another to get the aligned feature map. So we typically optimize this objective function, and as a result, we can get the displacement vector in green arrows in this figure. And once we have these arrows, then we know how much we have to apply for each location to move to the another. And once we apply this deformation to the feature map, then we have a aligned cortical features on unisphere. In the previous slide, we saw the displacement, which is green arrow here, brings one location to another, and this one is a result of a deformation field. So once we know that we know green arrow, then we know this location find a best match to the another part. So now let's think about the deformation itself. So we talked about trajectory in a couple of slides ago, and we used that trajectory to find the intermediate deformation. So now question is how we get the intermediate representation using this green arrow. So now let's think about the displacement a bit more. Okay, so we can think about two components on the sphere. So if we think about the polar coordinate, then we can have a two component. So for simple approach, let's think about just one component. All right, so if we collect all the signal along the equator, then we'll get this kind of 1D signal in spatial domain. So and typically, if we look at the traditional approach, then they optimize the local displacement on the spatial domain. So they find the best match for each location, and it can produce this kind of representation as a displacement vector for that specific component. But this one is somehow sensitive to local noise. So how about we think about this process in the frequency domain? So if you are familiar with Fourier transform, then we can really apply that idea to find a displacement across all the equator. So instead, we are optimizing the localized displacement. What if we find a coefficient for each basis function in frequency domain? Then we can get the result. If we add more and more frequency basis, then we can get the same result as the signal. And at the same time, we can also optimize all the displacement together, and we keep fine-tune all local displacement by adding more frequency samples. So this one is indeed finding a displacement is equivalent to find a set of coefficient in the frequency domain. And now we can extend this idea using spherical harmonics on the spherical domain. So pretty much same idea. So instead of we are finding a frequency, the coefficient in Fourier transform, we can find all the frequencies in the spherical harmonics. So this one is indeed equivalent to find a rotation for the very lowest frequency basis. And by adding more and more frequency basis, then we can get the more smooth and localized displacement. Okay, so this is a summary slide. So how we extend that idea to get the intermediate displacement? So the idea is pretty much simple. So if you're familiar with frequency signal reconstruction, then indeed we can just find spherical harmonic coefficient, and we can simply use first couple of spherical harmonic coefficient to get the intermediate displacement. So by adding more and more spherical harmonic coefficient, then we can get more fine-tuned displacement for each location. So in this approach, we can get more samples across, more smooth samples from rigid rotation to non-rigid local deformation as a result of a intermediate surface registration. Okay, so here's a result after we applying the surface registration for these 3 different cortical features. So we compute this registration and we find that all the coefficient. And as we discussed in the previous slide, we simply add more and more frequency basis, and we can reconstruct all the deformation from non-rigid to the local changes from one subject to another. And this is the features we use for cortical surface training. So we use a mean curvature, and we use a circle depth or average convexity of the cortical surface. And also we use a mean curvature of the inflated surface, and which are the features commonly used for surface registration that can represent a low resolution to high resolution details of the cortical structures. So this is additional technique we recently proposed for a better cortical surface annotation for the circle labels. So if you look at this figure, then we can divide the cortical sulci into 2 categories. So the first one is non-tertiary sulci, and they are known that developed in very early stage, like even before birth. So if you look at this curves, then they usually have a deeper and bigger representation, structural characteristics. But if you look at the tertiary sulci, and they are typically developed after birth, and they have a small branches from the non-tertiary sulci. So they have a kind of hierarchical relationship. So the non-tertiary sulci develop first, and then tertiary sulci develop later. So from this observation, so what if we know some kind of estimation of non-tertiary sulci, then maybe this information can guide a better labeling of the tertiary sulci. So if we apply this idea to the design of the machine learning architecture, then we can simply replace this part with 2 different pieces. So we can train our model with just non-tertiary sulci, so we can get the rough estimation of the location of all the non-tertiary sulci. And once we have that information, we can use that information as an additional feature for the next training for the estimation of all the sulci. Like we use these features to understand the other non-tertiary sulci, as well as we can also fine-tune the non-tertiary sulci using that information as well. So this is the last component of our framework. So we like to improve spatial coherence as a result of parcellation or circle labeling. So the machine learning techniques like a spherical convolutional net usually provide nice spatial coherence, but this is not always the case. So if you look at this figure, and if you see the region in this yellow circle, then we can see small pieces in a big region of the pink here. So how can you merge these black regions into the other part so we can avoid isolated regions as a result of our labeling process? So to do so, we use a graphical method. So this one is usually provide a nice spatial coherence. But the question is how we design the objective function to get the better segmentation result. So our observation is triangle size. So if you look at this figure, then we can see along the gyri, the triangle size are large. But if we look at the circle regions, then triangle size are small. So we can think from this observation, we can think the small triangle means circle regions and larger triangle means gyro regions. So for parcellation task, the parcellation typically defined by a circle boundaries. So we can use the small triangles for small penalty for the graphical process. And on the other hand, we can use small triangle for the large penalty for the circle labels. So we evaluate our method on two different tasks here. So one for the cortical surface parcellation. So we collected 400 samples and we use a brain color cortical surface labeling protocol, which use 49 labels. And in second task, we use the same technique, but for the circle labeling. So we use 60 pediatric samples and also 36 adult samples for this purpose. In this task, we use certain labels. So we have primary sulci, 6 primary sulci and 7 tertiary sulci. And this approach, we also use a context training, meaning we label the majority, the primary sulci first, and we use that information to label to give more information to the tertiary circle labeling. So this is a brief summary for data processing. So we use Presurfer version 6 for surface reconstruction for a parcellation task and the circle labeling task as well. And also all the surfaces are manually inspected. So if there's any misclassification of a tissue, then we also corrected this information to get the well reconstructed surfaces. And also we extract all the cortical features we discussed in the previous slide, and mean curvature and the other features for the training. And also we apply the data augmentation, of course. So we apply all the data, we compute the intermediate deformation for all the possible pairs from the samples. So we can just find the registration and we compute all the intermediate result by adding more basis functions. And for architecture, the training architecture, we use spherical CNN, and this one is proposed in this work. You can see in this reference. And we use a level 5 of icosahedral resampling for our samples to reduce, to feed our data to the graphics device. And this is a quick configuration for our settings, and we use this one for the training. Here's the first evaluation of our method. So we use a cross-validation, a 5-fold cross-validation to evaluate the performance of our approach. So we subdivide our samples into 5 partitions, and we use 3 partitions for training and the other 2 for validation and test. And we simply rotate all these partitions to get the 5 different cross-validation. And also we evaluate all this result at the minimum validation loss per fold. And this is a summary across 5 different evaluations. So as you can see in this figure, our approach, right-hand side here, can provide training stability. Means the standard deviation for the training loss is more stable than the training without data augmentation, and also the loss is smaller than the traditional approach without data augmentation. Here's a quick summary for the cortical surface parcellation, which is the first task. So in this evaluation, we use 2 different baseline methods. So one is the multi-plus approach, means we use a majority vote after surface registration. And the second approach is spherical unit, which we use for our approach as well, but this without data augmentation. So in the evaluation, we use a dice measure to dice measure over the manual segmentation, and we use that metric for the accuracy of the method. So if you look at the parcellation result, then against multi-atlas, we have 46 regions out of 49 improved. But we didn't find any regions with worse performance than the multi-atlas approach. And even spherical unit, our approach improved about the half of the regions. So still the data augmentation improved the labeling performance, even with the same spherical unit architecture. And also our method produce all the results within 1 minute. But if we look at the multi-atlas, the traditional method, then as expect, we have lots of registration process for the majority votes. So this one is much slower than our method. And this is a sulcal labeling task. So instead of we are labeling the entire cortex, so we focused on the prefrontal cortex. So here we have 4 different baseline methods. So once again, we have multi-atlas approach and unit approach, but without data augmentation. And also we add a rigid data augmentation, means we find all the rigid rotation across all the samples. And also we use a non-rigid data augmentation, which is the approach we proposed in the cortical parcellation task. But in our actual method here is combining non-rigid data augmentation and the context-aware training. So if you look at this bar graph, then we see our method, the final method is blue here. This one is significantly better than the other 3 approaches, like multi-atlas and unit without data augmentation, or the non-rigid, the rigid data augmentation in the overall performance. But if you look at the primary or secondary search side labeling, then our method is somehow similar to the rigid data augmentation here. So we didn't see any significant difference. But if we look at the tertiary search site labeling, then our method is still better than rigid data augmentation. And if we look at the non-rigid data augmentation, then this one is still, our approach is better. If we combining the context-aware training, then we can get the significantly better results than in the tertiary search site labeling. And this is a sulcal labels in the tertiary search site for the pediatric samples. So we still see similar patterns. So our data augmentation technique plus context-aware training can improve circle region, tertiary circle labeling compared to the other 4 baselines. And this is a qualitative result for single sample, just random sample from the pediatric data, which is the same in this figure. And still we can see the non-tertiary sulci are kind of similar performance across rotation and non-rigid approach. But if we look at the tertiary sulci labeling, then our method offers better segmentation result. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Thank you for your attention. And here are my collaborators for the parcellation and circle labeling work. And I thanks to all my collaborators. So if you are interested in my work, so you can just access my repo here, or you can just scan this QR code, then you can see all the source code and all the available data in that repo. And also, if you have any questions, then please contact me at this email address. Thank you.